Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alistair.
And this fortnight we are covering new multi-death science fiction film Mickey 17 featuring Robert Pattinson and the latest season of Invincible, the superhero cartoon on Amazon that we have given many good reviews to in the past. Will this be another one? And if you want a cheap and easy comparison between these two things, they do both star the very good actor Stephen Ewan. But before we get into all of Stephen Ewan's latest work, Alistair, what else have you consumed?
Right, well, I went to the theatre. This is not with my theatre reviewing hat on, which is one of my other critic hats that I wear. This was actually just out of pure enjoyment. Imagine that. Going to see something for enjoyment. But as ever, we must rinse some content out of it. So I'm here to talk about the play Dear England, which is on at the National Theatre right now. It's a revival of a successful run at the National Theatre from last year. And it's a play about Gareth Southgate's time as England manager, written by James Graham. As well as being a great play about football, it's kind of like a meditation on modern England. Like, who are we? And how that's summed up by the national team, or at least the national team under Southgate's leadership. And I can say it's a really, really good show. They do an amazing job of kind of recreating the atmosphere and the tension of football matches on stage through a combination of projections, to invoke the various stadiums and the backdrops. And yeah, just kind of great writing and acting to amp up the tension, especially the moments of taking penalties. There's quite a lot of the storyline is based around penalties and the England curse of never being able to successfully go through on penalties before Southgate's time, that was, and the drama of taking a penalty, which obviously works really well on stage. I just thought this was a really interesting way to bring a story to life that we're probably all familiar with, but this kind of takes you inside the story and really dramatizes these people, so I can strongly recommend this.
Okay, so was it mostly just focusing on the moment-to-moment drama of the actual football, or was it trying to talk widely about society?
It's mainly focused on the football, but that's kind of like a way to kind of discuss these themes in the background. It's not just about drama on the pitch. Obviously, it's a story that takes you behind the scenes, what it was like with Gareth Southgate taking over, the low expectations behind him, things like that. On some levels, the story is a fairly standard, man comes into new job, low expectations and struggles against institution inertia in order to overcome and succeed in the end. There's a lot of about how Gareth Southgate wants to change things up, make things less hierarchical, stop everyone calling him governor and just calling him Gareth, brings in a psychologist to get the players talking about their feelings as well as training to kick balls and things like that. And there's a lot of old school men basically being like, oh, I don't know about this talking about our feelings stuff, how does this relate to football, sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, on some levels that's a kind of fairly standard Maverick struggles against the institution plot, but it is interesting to watch that unfold. And then there's a kind of lace through this whole thing about the team represents modern England, the kind of diversity of the players, how represent different parts of the country, different ethnicities, different backgrounds, things like that. It does head on address things such as the racism that gets hurled at players, especially players of colour at matches, and the fact that they represent England, and in the past a lot of people who are in the team now wouldn't have been considered welcome in England or properly English. So it does address these things, but it's not there to give you a lecture or a big thesis on English identity. It's all very much in the background of the drama. But I suppose underneath it all is this I guess this kind of positive vision of English patriotism it's trying to present, of we are England, we're a modern, inclusive, diverse society where men can talk about their feelings and we support each other. It's proud to be English, but not jingoistic. So that's the political themes they're exploring.
And is it positive about the direction we're going in? I always got the feeling that Gareth Southgate seemed like a nice guy and was putting together a team with a very positive, worthwhile vibe. But I wasn't sure he changed the direction of the country that much.
I don't know if he changed the direction of the country. He certainly restored the country's pride in the national team. And there are some very good bits where they kind of bring in the public attitude by having scenes that are lots of people representing all sorts of different, roles, or people in society coming in and talking briefly about their views on the squad, which is supposed to be kind of the public mood bit. It's one of those plays where almost all the actors play about loads of different roles, most of them unnamed characters. It's the story I'm describing of this kind of person overcoming institutional inertia. Sounds like a lot of films and stuff. I don't really see this would work as a film because it moves so quickly from like scene to scene and character to character. It only really works on stage where someone can be a different character moment to moment, which allows them to bring in, they can go from like the England team locker room to a pub to a shop to, a workplace, to bring in this kind of sense of everyone's talking about England. Whether Southgate really changed, the national view of patriotism or our kind of national identity, I guess not, but it does get across very well that like he made everyone feel very positive about the team, really changed people's associations and feelings about English football. I guess he's the protagonist of the story, so it sets him up as like, oh yeah, he did this great thing and he succeeded in the end, and he achieved a lot by taking us to our first final on foreign soil and things like that. And there's various stats, for example, like Gareth Southgate has taken the England team to more finals and quarterfinals, I think, than all other previous England managers combined since 1966 and things like that. So it is to celebrate what he achieves. I suppose in terms of the kind of how the nation views itself, I get the feeling this is James Graham's attempt to put out like, this is how I think we are. This is what I think Englishness is. It's modern, it's diverse, it's inclusive, it's tolerant, it's not buttoned down, and like I say, with people willing to talk about feelings and difficult stuff. Whether that's what England actually is like, I don't know if it's Graham saying this is what we should be like, or this is what I think we really are like, but that's his view, I suppose. I mean, I respect him for basically wanting to write about a very deep, important issue, like kind of the national identity, and finding an interesting way to do it by telling it through the story of one man's time leading the national team. I think that's a very ambitious writing project, and he does it well. I don't think necessarily that England is a particularly progressive or tolerant place most of the time, although we can be some of the time, but I suppose that's a debate for another time.
I think England is good at a certain level of not caring whether you're different, but gets a bit weird when it's asked to actually care about people's differences. But anyway.
Yeah, I think that's probably quite right.
That's probably enough of Nick's sociological analysis for one day.
Yeah, but in terms of just like a great story about football, I can recommend this. And also, I want to say I'm not a particularly big football fan. I guess I watch England matches, when they're playing in international tournaments just to feel, part of the mood, to connect to other people. But I don't really follow the leagues or stuff outside that. I just occasionally nominally glance at the Premier League table to see how my hometown team of Leicester's doing. Badly, is the answer. But the point is, I feel as like someone who's not really a big football fan or really particularly into sport in general, I did find this as a really just exciting story. I feel that like you just get really invested in Gareth Southgate's journey and like, the kind of story they're telling through great writing, great acting. And also it's really dramatic considering you kind of know what's going to happen. You know that they go through on penalties against Colombia, and that's a big moment of actually doing it. You know that Rashford, misses a penalty, and that's a big moment. They don't win any of the finals they get to. You kind of know what's happening, but, there are lots of great stories where you know what's going to happen. Anything like, obviously, Argo, Lincoln, many things we discussed in this, anything that's about history, recent or the past. The point is like the storytelling in the moment gets you like hooked in these characters, and it's good at that. Again, it shows that James Graham's a talented writer because he managed to spin drama out of a story that I guess everyone knows basically what's going to happen when they sit down in the theatre, but they're still taking on this great journey with the writing and the acting. So I think it's really, really good on that level.
Did he address the man shoving a flare up his bum, or did that not really go with the message he wanted to portray about national identity?
Sadly, there is no flare-up bum moment. There is an amazing one-man show about shoving a flare up your bum for England. If you... I can't believe I said that. If you go to my Everything Theatre page, you'll see my review of that there. It's actually quite a funny story. So I feel the man with the flare up his bum has had more than enough time in the spotlight, to be honest.
Probably, yeah. Although, actually, I mentioned that mostly because it amuses me, but it does actually lead me on, I guess. The day that happens, the day that the stadium got basically mobbed on the day of the big final.
Yeah.
Was that general event a big part of the narrative? The general disorder of that?
No, it's not. And I guess that is a counter-argument or weakness in James Graham's, I guess, thesis on England, which is that he does skip over, the hooliganism of football. I know it's not like the 70s. Football hooliganism isn't what it was, but like there are still people who use football as an excuse to get absolutely tanked up, start fights and yell, like racist insults at each other, which is not really like discussed like at all. I mean, the play does address the racist abuse held at players. So there is that element of it, certainly. But yeah, as you say, it does make a big dramatic moment, that final at Wembley against Italy. That is a big dramatic moment in the play, and it doesn't discuss, the fact that, people got drunk and just stormed their way into the stadium. And I believe the way they got in is they stormed their way through the disability access to the stadium, which has less security on it than the main entrance, because you can't storm the main entrance of Wembley. And obviously there was a lot of disabled people who'd paid for their tickets trying to get in, absolutely terrified by huge numbers of drunk England fans just rioting their way through. And all of that aspect of it is not addressed. I mean, I guess you can't capture everything about football in one evening of theatre, but I feel you are right. You have hit on a weakness there, that he's very keen to hold up the positive vibes of the England national team. And I think he does make a good point that these England players are more socially conscious, more willing to highlight issues like food poverty and racism, more keen to support each other and provide positive role models than past England players that were either drunk a lot of the time and starting fights themselves, or pretending they were rap stars and rolling around in limousines and just trying to just generally act obnoxious in public because they're big deal celebrities. So I can get his point that this current generation of players are more socially responsible and better role models, but by all means they've not cleaned up football as a game. There's still a lot of problems.
Yeah, I mean, it does increasingly kind of sound like the message of this is, this is maybe just me applying it to things I've seen, but it does remind me increasingly of Ted Lasso.
Yeah, it's got a sort of Ted Lasso vibe. I think, if you like your football-based entertainment, then, it's got very much Ted Lasso. I guess what Ted Lasso and this have in common, which is what we really like in Britain especially, which is a heartwarming British underdog story. And this is very much a heartwarming British underdog story. No one expected Southgate to succeed. He wanted to do things differently, and then he goes on to be, let's say, the most successful England manager since 1966. Again, Ted Lasso, no one expects an American who doesn't really understand Britain or the rules of football to do well. But just through, being a good guy and trying hard and having a positive attitude, he succeeds. And we love stories like that. That's one of the reasons why, Ted Lasso's success and this has been a success. I think, on a deeper level, they are trying to say something about football providing positive inspiration. It's the national sport and it can be a source of pride, positiveness, good values and good role modelling. So, I think there's that element to both of them as well. In that sense, there's a connection there. But also, I haven't seen as much Ted Lasso as you have, but certainly this kind of swerves the darker side of football. And I assume Ted Lasso is not so keen to go there.
No, not really. I think it may be mentioned a couple of times in a sort of very special episode way, but it's certainly very keen to focus on the broad positivity.
Yeah, exactly. And after all the positivity brought by the England team, I think a lot of people did feel it was, very much ruined by, the outbreak of hooliganism in that final against Italy. So, it's a complex thing. This play has been very well received by the beard-stroking opinion writing class because basically, again, people want to say, this is a positive vision of Englishness and, a positive vision of patriotism and things like that. And I think it does make a good argument on that front, and it is a good piece of writing. But I feel, what we're getting at is kind of the national identity is more complex than this. And I feel that, pointing towards Dear England and saying, here's positive patriotism, this is what England's like, does sidestep everything from the kind of the violence of the past to the violence of the present. But at least it's interesting and gets you thinking and does actually have an argument to make about national identity that's not jingoistic.
Yeah, as long as it's actually doing something interesting, then that's still, valuable in itself. Not everything has to cover the entire spectrum of human experience.
No, I suppose, and it's maybe an unrealistic standard to hold it to. But I would say that it is an interesting play with a lot to say. I think maybe combined with that play Jerusalem that was also, hugely popular a few years ago, which is another meditation on English identity. But I would say also, as well as it's been an interesting thing, it is just a very tense, exciting watch. So and that there's a lot of tension, there's a lot of drama that comes out of it. Say, it opens with Southgate failing to score the penalty in 1996. There's a big kind of dramatic opening moment, and then goes through a lot of penalties and matches and stuff and brings a lot of drama out of, again, a story we're all familiar with. So I think, of all the things I've seen on the stage recently, this is something that I feel really has broad appeal and is something I can wholeheartedly recommend.
Nice.
But anyway, I've been in the theatre recently. Nick, what have you been up to since we last spoke?
Well, I've been at home, partly because I was briefly quite messily ill, and I have been watching Hacks. This is an American show which I think is on Max over there and is currently up on Sky over here. This is a sort of mismatched / codependent buddy comedy drama about an aging Hollywood comic called Deborah Vance, played by Jean Smart, who we might know from Legion, who has been around for a while, was a bit of a legendary trailblazer in her day, but is now just kind of in a sort of gentle semi-retirement, playing the same show every night in a residency in Vegas, until one day she's told her residency is being cut down because she's just not as relevant as she used to be. So her manager, in a bid to save the day, teams her up with a young writer from his stable. This is Ava, who is currently having trouble getting other jobs. She used to be writing for the cool, relevant young shows, but then she made some problematic drunk tweets and is now having trouble getting work. So she is packed off from LA to Vegas to work for this aging comedian who she kind of thinks is a bit of a has-been and has very little respect for, and they're sort of forced to work together because, well, neither of them really have a choice, and that sort of develops from there. And yeah, it's as I say, it's a sort of mismatched codependent friends thing. They end up both working well together and forming a sort of close, almost surrogate mother-daughter relationship, but also kind of struggling to get past the fact they both resent the fact they have to work together and come from quite different backgrounds. Ava is a sort of obnoxious borderline Gen Z caricature who lectures extensively on social issues whilst occasionally having her hypocrisy pointed out by the aging comedian. And yeah, Deborah Vance is both a demanding egomaniac and very old school in a lot of ways, and yeah, they just bounce off each other a lot. And yes, it's a comedy about their developing relationship and their eventual success despite their alarming amount of self-sabotage. And yeah, this is good. This is a lot of fun. It's been going for 3 seasons with a 4th about to start. It's won a lot of awards, partly because it's very good and partly, I'm sure, because Hollywood loves a good show about Hollywood. So yeah, I thought I would catch up on it, and yeah, good show, good time.
Yeah, sounds very good. My partner really likes this show. She's seen quite a bit of it. Yeah, I haven't actually watched it myself, but it does sound both really good setup for both comedy and drama. What is the sort of tone they're shooting for with the comedy?
Blackly comic sadness a lot of the time. There's a lot of, I don't know, it's funny because the thing they've just said exposes the sadness at the core of their own life. And, you know, some actual jokes as well. Obviously, it's about comedy writers. They're also allowed to actually be funny. And, you know, because it's a comedy drama, there are occasionally triumphant moments or genuinely sad parts. At times, and this may just be because it's a bit of a generational touchstone, there are moments that remind me of Peep Show, where the two codependent idiots both help each other and sabotage each other. It's going well for one, and then the other one fucks it up.
Yeah, that sounds very, yeah.
That's very Peep Show. That's the classic Peep Show beat. I don't think it wants to be quite as aggressively bleak as Peep Show. There are moments where they're actually allowed to succeed, although often with some sort of sting in the tail.
Yeah, that does sound very good. Yeah, definitely my sort of jam, kind of that kind of bleak, dark humor, but yeah, or sad humor. Also kind of reminds me a little bit of, Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, which is quite funny, but also, yeah, exposing the sadness behind it all. Again, maybe not quite as bleak as that could be at moments.
It has its moments of extreme bleakness. I don't think it's quite as interested in talking in depth about depression and mental breakdowns as Crazy Ex-Girlfriend was, but it's definitely interested in, I don't know, this feeling of being, you know, as per the title, a hack or a failure, or this sense that you're just not getting anywhere, or people just don't care about you, or that things just keep going wrong. I don't know, I guess there's the reminder that both from Deborah Vance's end as a successful, enduring comedian, and Ava's end as this newcomer desperately trying to get her foot in the door and actually achieve anything. There's always this sense that no one actually gives a damn. Like, in Deborah's case, everyone just kind of writes her off because she's been around forever. In Ava's case, no one cares because she's just some kid.
Yeah. Again, the mutually codependence, I suppose, comes through in that yeah, they're both characters that people are given up on and they're kind of on their last straw.
Yeah, and they're good sort of comedy characters because you're able to sympathise with them up to a point. They are often right about stuff, you know. Ava is often allowed to be right about the terrible things that Deborah does, or the fact that Deborah could maybe try thinking about other people for a while, or stopping and being a bit more reflective rather than just doing the same thing she always does just because she always has. But on the other hand, Deborah is also right that Ava often just sits around constantly self-analysing and pontificating and never actually has any fun or achieves anything.
Yeah, I feel there's also they're saying something wider about generations there, but I guess not in a sort of mean-spirited, try and have a dig at the other's way, I guess sort of like trying to use these characters to talk about the generational divide.
Yeah, as I say, they're both allowed to have a point. You know, a lot of the time there are sub-episodes where things are going well for one and others when they're going well for the other. And sometimes the other one fucks it up for them, other times they end up just commiserating over their mutual failures. Or sometimes successes. Once or twice a series, one or both of them usually gets to win, just to stop it being too much of a relentless bummer.
Yeah. And it sounds like a lot of other shows that, or reminds me of other shows that the whole thing is going behind the scenes of the comedy writing process. I'm feeling things like, 30 Rock and Studio 60 on the Sunset Strip. Is there a similarity there?
I don't know if there's a huge similarity beyond the subject matter. I mean, Studio 60 obviously was a bit too self-serious. Sorry, Aaron Sorkin, I love you, but comedy writing is not as important as running the world. And 30 Rock was very, very silly, which works because, well, partly because it was actually funny and partly because comedy writing is silly. And this, I mean, to be honest, it's more a portrait of the people rather than about the nuances of day-to-day work in comedy. Obviously, it helps if you have a vague idea some of the things they're referring to, like there's a long subplot about Deborah Vance's quest to get a gig hosting a late-night chat show, and, that'll maybe mean more to you if you have a vague understanding of, the importance and the legacy of late-night chat shows in America.
Yeah.
Which I have at least some idea of, probably not as much as an actual American. But on the other hand, it's not what the show is fundamentally about. You can still just watch the show if you know that this is a thing that Deborah wants and has wanted for a long time, and therefore she is absolutely myopically obsessed with it.
Yeah.
Because it's more about, the characters and their psychology than it is commenting at length on the industry. The industry satire is mostly just dished out as little barbs or asides or subplots featuring comedy one-off characters who are just basically, caricatures of awful celebrities or awful managers.
Yeah, I suppose there's a lot of right material there to be. Yeah, I guess the thing about anything set in showbiz is we've seen so many stories set in showbiz going all the way back to Singing in the Rain or things like that, probably even before that we're kind of aware of the archetypes and the sort of people that turn up in these things in order to be riffed off in this way. So yeah, that kind of helps you with the comedy writing.
Well, yeah, and ultimately, though, because it is, it's not as silly as 30 Rock, it is a sort of semi-serious in its character drama moments. I don't think it wants to go too far into either aggressively silly comedy, caricature, satire, or the other option, which is to have loads and loads of real-life cameos from real-life celebrities self-consciously playing themselves. There's a couple. There's enough. Let's just put it that way.
I feel the thing with that is that, it can really distract from the overall story. Is that person doing a bit? Can really, distract you from the actual story you're trying to tell about the core characters. It's alright if they pop up for a moment to do, a brief bit occasionally, but that sort of stuff can be overindulged in.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've got Jean Smart doing quite a layered dramatic performance about this older woman thinking about her life and her regrets, and it's a bit distracting if you've then got, I don't know, The Rock popping up going, "Hey, it's me, The Rock. Want to do some comedy at my birthday party?"
Yeah.
So they don't do that, thankfully.
Yeah. But it sounds really good, and it's one of those shows that I'd want to watch, and it's on the list. Partly because as a writer, I am just fascinated by other shows about writing, because I just love things that dig into the process of writing and things like that. It's one of the reasons why I did kind of enjoy Studio 60 on the Sunset Strip, even though it was very preachy. But I've heard really good things of the show. Like I say, my partner really likes it. She, I think, really connected with the characters, and that's kind of what you need for a show to succeed.
Yeah, and I think the core two characters are a very, very well-written, believable dynamic, and that's what keeps it going. There's a good sort of orbis of supporting characters around them who are fun as well, but basically you're there for the main two, and they're just very good. Jean Smart and Hannah Einbinder, who plays Eva, who are both excellent. I think Jean Smart has won multiple Emmys for Best Comedy Actress for this part, and to be honest, fair enough.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So yeah, no, it's good. I think the first 3 seasons are up now, and the 4th one's starting next month. So yeah, I'll be there. I'm going to be ready. I've only got about 2 or 3 episodes left to watch.
Cool. Good to know that, another show that people are talking about is good and is continuing to do well, and new seasons of it are coming out rather than being inadvertently stopped. There's a lot of stuff on Netflix is. I know that's a point we make a lot, but it remains true.
Yeah, no, there was a rumour that they had a 5-season master plan, so hopefully they only need to get renewed one more time, and considering it seems to be still winning the Emmys, I would hope that they'll probably let it have that final season.
Next up this episode, we will be discussing Mickey 17, Bong Joon-ho's follow-up to the Oscar-winning Parasite, starring Robert Pattinson. Pattinson plays Mickey, a hapless idiot who gets a job on a spaceship as an expendable to escape from Earth. This means that he's given all the worst jobs and dies over and over. Every time he dies, a new Mickey is printed out to suffer again. Unfortunately, due to a mistake, Mickey 17 doesn't die, and Mickey 18 is printed. This creates duplicates, the rule for which they all must be killed. This leads to a series of comedy, pratfalls, and some dramatic tension, as you'd expect. We saw this film in the cinema recently. Nick, what did you think of it?
Yeah, this is an enjoyable movie for the most part. It's a very fun premise and vibe, I think. It's a very enjoyable, good hang type film. It looks like it's going to be another sort of, to be honest, as I was saying last week about Companion, another sort of black comedy, drama, satire episode of Black Mirror film. But because Bong Joon-ho's got a slightly weirder sense of humour than that, some slightly odder things going on, he's a bit more willing to go silly than Charlie Brooker is. It does stand out and have a very distinct voice. And Robert Pattinson is really leaning into that. He's clearly having a bit of fun playing, as he often does, I think, playing a weird little guy, putting on a silly voice and fully going for it. I don't think it fully works. It's not, I don't know, there's just something about it that doesn't quite stick the landing for me. I think it possibly runs a bit long for the tone it has, and the ending just seemed a bit rambling and over-involved. I sort of wanted a sort of short, sharp, satirical point, and instead it just went on for ages. But yeah, the good bits are really good, and so especially the core bit in the middle, when they're introducing Mickey and setting up the world, and then having the second one get printed and having them go through their ridiculous misunderstandings and their comedy reactions of everyone else to the presence of two Mickeys and his girlfriends wanting a threesome and all that weird stuff, and Robert Pattinson doing the dual performance as the two of them. Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff there. It just went slightly awry in the final act for me.
Yeah, I agree with you that the tone doesn't quite stick the landing. That's one of the feelings I came away with it from. But I think overall it was really good, and especially the tone is the thing that I liked. In the last episode, I talked quite a bit about how much I liked the tone of Companion, again, mixing the sort of the darkness, the violence, but also like splashes of humor. I like the tone again with this. I mean, the slider is pushed slightly towards the silly end in this one, and it is kind of quite interesting how it mixes this sort of dark tone with quite a lot of slapstick violence and political satire. The tone very much, I feel, it had a very distinctly sort of Terry Gilliam vibe, in that everything's a bit like larger and brighter and sort of louder than reality, and everything was kind of quite silly, and there's this sort of element of like bureaucratic processes have run out of control and taken over a life of their own and kind of become weird and sort of self-reflective, which is why, yeah, with this whole thing of kind of Mickey just living out all these ridiculous lives and just sometimes just being printed out so he can be killed for a sort of slightly pointless science experiment, or just being dropped on a planet to see if there's a virus and then dying horribly from a virus. It all struck me as quite Terry Gilliam-esque, with the fact that the lovable doofus, absolute idiot nature of the Mickey 17 character really reminded me of a character basically taken straight out of The Simpsons. So if you can imagine someone with that kind of lovable idiot side of a Simpsons character in a Terry Gilliam film, you're kind of about 90% of the way there with this. Bong Joon-ho's a great director, and he's really good at mixing different tones together. Parasite was brilliant at like kind of shifting tones from like satire to outright comedy to thriller tension and being quite scary. And it is more common, I think, in stories and media from the Far East to shift tones quite dramatically. It's the thing that happens more than in Western media. So I guess what I'm trying to say is there's a lot going on here, and I'm not sure it fully worked because there was a lot of things going on, but I really kind of respected this film's ability to have a tone that was quite different to normal and quite unusual and genuinely funny and stuff. So I kind of respect it for shooting high if it didn't quite nail the kind of high mark it was shooting for.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've been very complimentary of films that have done that sort of thing in the past. This sort of wild tonal shift, sort of combination of a big genre concept, a slightly silly tone, and then an ultimate pivot towards seriousness, I remember me raving about Colossal in the early-ish days of the podcast. And this, yeah, is definitely shooting for something like that. I'm not sure it entirely nails it, but I'm not going to complain about films trying to do the thing I like, even if they don't all pull it off brilliantly.
I think the comparison with Colossal is a very apt one because, again, that's one that mixes similar tone and things like that. And as you were saying before, this film is possibly a bit long and kind of a bit rambly at the end. It's got quite a lot of characters, which I quite like. There's all these different people and they've kind of got their own little like weird thing going on with them. Again, that's kind of a bit Terry Gilliam-esque. But there's a lot of time it does spend focus on what's going on with other characters other than Mickey 17, and maybe a bit more discipline of like bringing it back to just focus on him, focus on the core story. Might have made it like a bit tighter, a bit funnier, and a bit more successful. And Colossal does do that by really always looping it back to the main character, the Anne Hathaway character. But, this kind of was a bit more sprawling, which is maybe why it didn't work quite so well.
Well, yeah, then again, I can't really fault Bong Joon-ho for being ambitious. And to be honest, a lot of the stuff that is good and works is some of the big sprawling stuff. Like, there's a lot of world building in this. There's a lot of like thoughts put into this sort of weird, somewhat religious society that they live in, and that's led to having these strange rules around this duplicate process and this sort of backstory about this serial killer. And yeah, it's all quite fun and quite interesting and quite sort of off the wall and strange. Like, it would be very easy to make this film just have the corporation invented the people printing be a vague Apple or Amazon analog, and just have them getting coldly pumped out because it's somehow more efficient to make money. but that's not what Bong Joon-ho's done here. He's made up some random shit, and fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. Like, the whole rule that there can't be duplicates of these expendables as they get printed out, which is kind of the thing that leads to most of the drama when you end up with two Mickeys. They could have just been like, it's just the rule, and that's the rule, you know? The audience doesn't really need more than that. But instead, you get this whole kind of 5-minute bit that's kind of a little short film stroke comedy sketch about this guy who invented the technology who turned out to be a serial killer. And it's just like,
Yeah,
the whole film just like stops just for this little bit. It's quite funny and kind of random, and I just kind of like the fact it's just shot off in this bizarre tangent for a moment.
Well, yeah, but the whole film has this sort of weird voice. Like, you can constantly hear Mickey 17 talking, but it's never clear when he's talking or who he's talking to. He's just always talking to you. And it keeps shooting off to, fill in his backstory, and then, as you say, fill in the technology's backstory. It just works because that's just the way it is, and that's one of the things that's really good about it. It just gives you this floating view that just takes in the whole world.
Yeah, and it kind of builds out this kind of Earth where it's sort of hints at this is it's a dystopian sort of authoritarian society where everything's done through these like bizarre tribunals and stuff. But there's also a lot of crime and people live in poverty, and then there's gangsters like carving people up with chainsaws at one point. And then they're all escaping on this spaceship, which is where he gets the job on, which is kind of run by this sort of weird religious cult stroke political cult with Mark Ruffalo as their head, basically doing a big impression of Trump. I mean, that's probably the best thing in the film. I mean, Robert Pattinson is great and he's really good at playing a comedy doofus. But my favorite thing about the film was Mark Ruffalo basically doing Trump as kind of businessman stroke cult leader on like a space arc, weirdly like obsessed of like who's having sex with who and things things like that. And like it is like Mark Ruffalo, who's incredibly talented, doing this big, silly, over the top camp villain performance. But it is just really, really funny.
But I still think the Pattinson performance is pretty good. But yeah, Ruffalo is very, very good in this, and it's very, very silly. I mean, he's definitely, doing a bit, doing a voice, doing an impression, doing a massive, silly villain performance. So I'm sure some people will just find it irritating. He's impressive, but Robert Pattinson is acting quite hard, and Mark Ruffalo manages to overact way over that level. It's impressive, It's fun, it's, one of the bits of the film that works.
Yeah, absolutely. And even things like, I mean, it's not subtle. Like, all of his followers have like little red hats and things like that. And they're all like obsessed with how great he is and stuff. And like, they all live in the kind of bowels of the spaceship eating like reprocessed goo while he like has these elaborate banquets with his slightly strange wife who's some kind of social media personality or something like that. And, it's really not subtle, but it is, however, very, very funny. It kind of really works with the tone. Again, I keep coming back to it, but there's something quite Terry Gilliam about this big kind of awful dictator figure that Ruffalo's playing. But there's all these like bizarre things like Tim Key is there as well, for some reason always dressed as a chicken, and that's never really explained. And there's lots of like random funny asides like that, and there's all these other strange people he lives with, such as his friend who he ran away with, who's always getting involved in some kind of stupid crime and getting caught from it and nearly killed. There's a whole other series of like supporting characters who are just kind of like weird, strange people. Each one has got like a sort of comedy foible to them. Again, it's a bit Gillian-esque. It's quite Simpsons, really. There's a whole world here of kind of these weird people.
Well, yeah, I mean, like you do in a good one of these films, there's a sort of a clear system set up. There's a lot of, sets that work with it. There's the big disposal chute sort of incinerator thing where they dump the used up Mickeys. There's the printer. And, like a good sort of sci-fi film, you show the setup working a few times, and then you can start showing the process going wrong or being interfered with or working in strange, funny ways or going through like long montages of stupid shit happening with it. And obviously he does do all those things, and it's good fun.
Yeah, I get the feeling they had real fun sort of making this and writing it and things like that. It's kind of like every like silly idea was just like included. Such as like one of my favorite ones is the one when they're printing out Mickey and they've just forgotten to put the table next to the printer, so he just sort of flops out onto the floor in a sort of undignified lump, and it's because someone's like listening to music on their phone and not paying attention. And it's just like a comedy beat, but it really stuck in my head as like, that's just really silly and funny.
Yeah, no, that was fun. And again, you respect Pattinson for fully committing to that stupid floppy pratfall, like he's just been plopped out like a sausage.
Yeah, you're right. He does do a great performance in this. Partly, again, giving both of the Mickeys like a different personality. Like Mickey 18 is like quite nasty and like violent and things like that. There's a funny bit when he just tries to kill the original Mickey so that there can't be duplicates, and he just sort of just throws like a dumbbell at his head or something like that. And there's a sort of comedy slapstick element to it that's kind of maybe a bit Terry Gilliam or a bit Simpsons. It's kind of a bit violent, but also it's violence, but like there doesn't seem to be any consequences to it.
Apart from Mickey constantly dying.
Apart from Mickey constantly dying, but he just comes back as they print out another one. Yeah, I thought Patterson was very good doing like being the real core of this film, giving both Mickeys a personality, making Mickey 17 lovable for being like an absolute doofus. And yeah, he really is like, doing some great work here.
Yeah, I mean, the Mickey 17-18 dynamic, I think I've seen similar things in other duplicate films. Like, I mean, I think the first time I encountered it might have been an episode of Buffy, actually, season 5 episode, where they accidentally create a second Xander, who Xander, the original Xander, is convinced is evil because he feels seems like a more confident version of him, and rather than being a sort of insecure nerd, and therefore he must be somehow evil. But it turns out he's just, a slightly different version of the same personality. And, I've seen that sort of dynamic before, but it's fun here. Pattinson does it well, making them seem like different people and yet the same person.
That's the shtick, making them seem like different people and stuff. It's partly because, when they're on screen together, you need to know which one's Mickey 17 and Mickey 18. I mean, at one point they get given jackets with their numbers on them, which does help. Yeah, and there's also a broader sci-fi story here about their arriving on the planet and they're trying to colonize this planet, and there's an indigenous species there that looks like a combination of a woolly mammoth and a woodlouse. There's a whole plot line involving that. I mean, that's maybe I like the whole thing about there's this indigenous species, and then the Mark Ruffalo Trump guy wants to just wipe it out, and Mickey wants to befriend it, and there's some scientists who want to study the aliens. But it does kind of become quite sort of rambly at the end and kind of goes off into this big thing about this kind of fight with these aliens. And although there's some good moments in there, and it does tie the film up quite well, it does become a bit more sprawling maybe in the end as it adds more and more elements to it. But I did like the fact that there was a genuine sort of sci-fi plot running through this whole film, as well as the comedy elements we talked about, and it's kind of the political satire as well.
I think the stuff with the indigenous alien species at the end, I don't know, they're very cute, and there were some nice moments, especially when it was early on. I think it was a bit thinly sketched. Like, a lot of this film, as we've said a few times, has a sort of an interesting swerve on certain tropes, or a unique angle, or a strange perspective. And the indigenous species stuff was a bit dead straight. It was not as interesting, and I don't know, was there a note somewhere from the studio asking him to please give it a bigger action climax? Who knows. There's not much point in backseat speculating, I guess, but it didn't feel like it worked as well as the rest of it.
Yeah, that's unfortunate, but it did tie the film together, and I suppose it really allowed them to explore the dynamic of the central dynamic of Mickey's nice and lovable. There's these other humans who want to do good things, and the Trump guy is just awful and just wants to kill things he doesn't like. I mean, it's all kind of linking into, I guess, the underlying message of this film. I mean, it's quite strongly anti-capitalist, anti-authoritarian sort of film. As I was saying, it's not subtle, and who it's taking aim at, from kind of exploitative corporations, messianic politicians who want to destroy things and control people and hoard stuff for themselves, and the everyday person being generally decent but exploited by this big authoritarian system that surrounds them. It's not really subtle, but it is trying to say something on a political level, and with the peaceful indigenous aliens that they encounter is part of that. But I guess similar to Parasite, Bong Joon-ho is really good at having things going on many, many levels. There's a political message, there's a character bit going on, there's humor, there's tonal shifts, there's these strange characters, their little weird moments and things going on. So he's really good at getting lots of stuff coming together and building this complex world of all these different things going on in it. And although some of it may be less subtle or quite on the nose, I do like the fact that, again, he's so good at getting all this stuff into one film.
Yeah, as I say, I respect the wild tonal shifts and huge amount of stuff shoved into this film. It's the sort of thing where even if I didn't think it 100% nailed it, I'm glad they made it. I'm glad that we're still putting a decent amount of money into making this kind of ambitious, slightly odd original sci-fi film. I hope it's not the last one ever made.
Yeah, it does remind me of something from a different time period. There's something that feels quite sort of 90s sci-fi film about it. I don't know if, I say, it's the Terry Gilliam vibe, that it feels a little bit like Brazil, a little bit like 12 Monkeys. It also feels a little bit like Fifth Element, another film that's a bit over the top and kind of loud and bright and colourful with these larger than life characters. There's things like that running through it, and also the fact that this is not based on a pre-existing media property or a famous book. It is adapted from a book, but not a sort of sci-fi classic, like Dune or whatever. So it does feel like it's doing a thing on its own terms, in its own way, on the strength of the story, which feels like something that was done more in the 90s. I guess the reason why they got to make this film is that, it's Bong Joon-ho who made Parasite, and Robert Pattinson, who's famous in Batman and things like that. And that gave them probably the freedom and the budget to make a film like this. Slightly disappointing. I don't think it's been wildly successful, which, may mean they don't make many more of things, at least not on this scale in the cinema. Maybe it'll go back to Netflix or something like that. But it does feel refreshingly different to most of the stuff that you see in the Hollywood blockbuster. And it is quite intelligent, and although, again, with a lot of dumb humor, it's again, it's intelligent the way The Simpsons is with dumb humor. And it is, I feel, like a film made for grown-ups. So, I mean, I like all these elements of it. Finally, this episode, we will be discussing the third season of Invincible. Mark is now a full-time superhero, protecting the innocent from villains and moving into a new phase of his life, outside the jurisdiction of the US military and in a relationship with Atom Eve. However, he also has to deal with new villains, his younger brother getting superpowers, and the looming Viltrumite invasion. We've seen the complete third season of the show on Amazon Prime. Nick, what did you think of it?
Yeah, after a couple of Invincible seasons which I really enjoyed and thought were surprisingly, really, really good, here's one I thought was merely quite good. Still not bad, but we've definitely hit a point of sort of status quo here. You know, the setup has been established, stuff is happening within it, they know they've been renewed for season 4 and they're sort of shuffling things around in their long game. There's still enough good individual bits to keep me relatively happy. You know, there's some brutal final battles, there's a new character, Powerplex, who has some interesting arcs, there's some particularly brutal, depressing shit at some points, especially in that Powerplex episode. But yeah, I don't know, I wasn't quite as blown away by this as I have been in past years, but I did still really enjoy it.
Yeah, I agree with you on that this was not as good as the previous 2 seasons, but that's still a very, very high standard. It's difficult to sound positive about something when you're saying it's not as good as it's been in the past, but I did really like this. I mean, Invincible came along, from my perspective, kind of out of nowhere. No, I gather the comic it's based on is very successful, but it was locked down, there wasn't a lot of stuff going on because, so much media being suspended, and this dropped on Amazon Prime, and it's basically like, oh wow, this is really, really good. And that first episode is really stunning and attention-grabbing. We've kind of established the dynamic. This one, there's a lot that goes on in this show. I think we said in our previous review, it's one TV show, but it seems like it's got a whole MCU worth of characters and plot lines and settings and worlds. They really cram it in, really efficient, dense storytelling, which is what I like about it. This season just I feel like a bit less focused, or maybe it wasn't tied back to the character drama enough, or the plot was maybe not quite as tight, but it did kind of feel like each bit was kind of shooting off in its own direction. So the plot line with the cabal of evil villains who want to rule the world, that's sort of separate, and there's the plot line about the Viltrumites was quite sort of separate. There's the plot line about the earthquake guy, there's the plot line with Alan the alien. They didn't feel as united as they did in the past. Maybe it's because, as you say, they've got a 4th season, so they're kind of shooting out in different directions to loop it all back around later. But yeah, it just didn't quite come together as beautifully in this season as the previous ones did.
Yeah, I don't know if it just didn't feel quite as defined. The first season was very defined, obviously, by the big Omni-Man arc. The second season was very defined by kind of everyone just sort of struggling to get over that, to be honest, which was obviously dramatised by him turning up again.
Yeah, and the sort of his kind of redemptive moment of that, him trying to save the planet of the bug people and things like that, and I guess there's not much Omni-Man in this season, and I get that, they want to build out Mark as the main character and take the story in other directions, not just make it all about his father, but I guess, if that element was, put on the back burner, what is the plot line for this season? I suppose it's mainly, his relationship with Atom Eve, which I thought was really nice and well done, and, felt like a real grown-up, real-life relationship, whilst also being in a superhero show as a relationship between 2 superheroes, so that worked well.
I thought that worked. I thought the stuff with his brother, I think mostly because that was probably the new big interesting thing for this season, his brother growing up at a sci-fi high speed and already becoming a sort of teenager and getting superpowers, and having to deal with that is probably the big new thing for this year. I think possibly that's kind of what I wanted more from this season, a slightly more tangible sense of what the big new plotline or the big new element was, what gave this season its identity compared to the last 2, instead of just being, here's some more Invincible. And if there was something doing that, it was probably the introduction of his brother and his brother's superpowers, and that was the stuff that I thought works the best for me, just for being the new interesting thing.
Yeah, you're right. That's the main plot thread, as well as the romance plot thread as well. And it does link into everything else. Mark taken more responsibility and, the relationship to his father. Now that he's got this half brother. I think at this point we're going to have to drop some spoilers for my next point. I'm not going to discuss the ending. We might get to that in a bit. But here's some mid-season spoilers. So if you want to be totally unspoiled, run now. Here's your chance. Last chance. Anyway, yeah, going back to what you were saying about the brother, Oliver, I thought the mid-season bit when he, just snaps and kills the Maulers was really effective. That's kind of classic Invincible. Something really dark and violent and disturbed kind of comes out of nowhere. It takes you by surprise. The Maulers have been in the first episode, and I assume they were kind of here to stay, but they've just been totally killed off. I mean, the show does have a liberal attitude to bringing back dead people, I suppose. But yeah, that was quite shocking and sudden, and I thought very good.
Yeah, that was a good moment. That was probably where this season really got a bit of identity and crystallised for me, yeah, when they really snapped into that storyline with the Oliver character. I mean, I'm about to drop some loose finale spoilers, so I guess, if you left from the spoiler warning a few minutes ago, then keep running. Yeah, I think the finale, it ended on this message of, yeah, they've been going through this sort of is it right to kill thing. Like at the end of season 2, Mark killed Angstrom Levy, or thought he did, because he felt he had to, and then he angsted about it for quite a while, and then Oliver killed the Maulers, and at the end of this season, Mark kills a different supervillain because he feels he has to. And the journey, the character journey is, he started the season really angsty about this, and he ends the season going, no, okay, fair enough. This is justified sometimes. Sometimes we just have to kill people. And yeah, I can see that arc on paper. I don't know if it's as dramatic a flex as they necessarily think it is, maybe, I'm not sure, but I can see what they were going for.
Yeah, it did feel like a big step forward when Mark decides, yeah, it's okay to kill people. I suppose, I don't know if the overall character arc they're going with him with is a sort of loss of soul plot line, that like his power, his like absolute like sort of supreme godlike power will consume him and mean he loses his humanity. I guess like his father did in becoming a villain in the previous season. First season.
Well, yeah, that is, I guess, the obvious next jump, yes. Mark deciding, actually, yeah, sometimes it is okay for me to just kill people. A big step towards him becoming his father. You would hope they'll probably address that next season.
Yeah, even if he doesn't become a Viltrumite, he might still just become, like, again, a horrible person, which I feel the revelation about his father is not that he's a Viltrumite, it's that he's a horrible, violent person, which is why it really worked in the first season with that switch around of, like, yeah, the great hero turns out to be a monster. So maybe they're going towards that. And it did feel like, I guess, a step forward towards this. And the fight at the end with Conquest did feel like they were upping the tension, upping the ante. I mean, each season, this is the third season, each one has ended up with Mark fighting a Viltrumite. And when Conquest appeared at the end of the 7th episode, I did feel like, oh, are they doing another Viltrumite fight finale again? But they did actually, when it actually came around to watching the episode, it did actually feel like they'd stepped up the tension, they'd upped the ante, they'd increased the sort of scope and scale of the action, brought in more characters and more emotional moments. So I felt they did like escalate it. And the last episode was, again, one of my favorite bits of the season. And also in character progression, it just, yeah, I guess there was something about like it just seemed to meander a bit on its way to get there.
Part of me does wish they'd maybe introduce some more substantial new elements at some point, which I guess, since, as you said, this show is absolutely massive, that maybe there's a limit to how many new things they can really shove in. But considering the season ends with an episode where he fights Angstrom Levy, and then an episode where he fights an evil Viltrumite, and, that was how the last 2 seasons ended.
Yeah.
Season 2 fights Angstrom Levy, Season 1 fights an evil Viltrumite. And I do get that, there's some very intentional mirroring going on between the fight with his father at the end of season 1 and the fight with Conquest at the end of season 3. Like, there's some scenes where they are literally homaging their previous shots. So, yes, I do get that they're intentionally calling back to that. But yeah, still, part of me did finish this season crying out for some really new, exciting beats.
Yeah, they did show his growth. But yeah, and you're right, that you did feel like kind of they were doing similar stuff. I feel with this season what they did is they spent quite a bit of time like building up like supporting characters and things. Again, making this all feel like all these complex characters, keeping them going. Like, they built up the guy who, trying to take on the Order, the kind of the guy you thought was a super villain, but end up like, he's cleaning up his community and trying to like reduce violence and crime and things like that. And they've built that character up a bit and his kind of struggle with the other supervillains. Again, they had the whole arc with the Powerplex character, quite a complex character they built up with some interesting bits. It kind of reminded me a bit of Batman vs Superman, that bit. Although yeah, in like one episode they kind of did Batman vs Superman way better than Batman vs Superman did. I mean, that's what the great thing about this show is. It can just do like a whole MCU film's worth of plot as like the B plot in one episode. In this, the writing is just that tight. But I did feel they spent a lot of time like building up other characters. Like, again, Rexplode. I mean, what a great name for a character. His redemption arc, softly becoming a nicer guy, moving on with his life. That I felt, worked well, time building up him. There was more about Monster Girl and Robot. And all this stuff probably sounds kind of weirdly, I don't know, abstract, or like you're just sort of throwing out sort of Marvel names, but like actually all these characters are like 3-dimensional, have like a whole thing and like a plot line to them. There's the whole thing about Eve and her relationship with her parents and her desire to like become an architect and do some good in the world that's not just firing lasers at supervillains. So they really build up the plot line. There's the plot line with his mum moving on from and dating again. There's so much in here. So maybe I felt that it's building up all these other things. I'm sure there's whole things I've forgotten as well. Like building up all these other things maybe meant there was like less focus on Mark this time because they were building up everything else. But they do really, really cram a lot into this.
Yeah, no, I don't think there was a loss of content this season. It's definitely still keeping this entire universe spinning. And yeah, as I say, they know they've got a season 4. They could well bring out season 4 and completely nail it again. I will be interested to see where it next goes. I mean, I gather this is quite faithfully adapting the comic, which I have read, but that was a few years ago now, and I've forgotten most of what happens, apart from a few very broad outlines. So, we'll see.
as long as it still tempts you to watch.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. And obviously the other thing about it is it's still like just really, really violent. I like the fact that like they always take the violence to like the next level. Like it always goes like a bit beyond where you think it's going to go, and probably a bit beyond what you're really comfortable with. Like one little moment I thought sums this up, but it's by no means the only one, is like when Mark's fighting Conquest in the final episode, there's a bit when Conquest punches him in the face loads of times, and then Mark spits out some teeth and some blood. You're like, oh, that's pretty gross. And then he spits out more and more, and like he does it like about 4 times, and there's more blood each time. And you're kind of like, oh, most shows have been like, right, he gets punched in the face, spits out some teeth and some blood. That shows that he's actually feeling pain. This is challenging. But no, oh, that's quite a lot of vomiting blood, for that moment. And it's a bit like, yeah, you really had to go to like the next level. And there's a few bits when people's heads get caved in, and it's not just like crash blood. It's like, oh, that's a bit of brain and that's a bit of eyeball. Like, it's really gross.
Yeah, the second to last episode of this season is so grim and massive in terms of carnage and consequences. But I genuinely was watching it thinking, is there going to be a time travel reset at the end of this? Because I'm starting to wonder how the world can continue to function.
Yeah, especially also then with Conquest. In the end of the first season, Chicago gets devastated, which I did like how they picked up the real world consequences of that with the Powerplex character in this season. In the finale with Conquest, they go through like 5 or 6 cities, just absolutely wrecking them. And like, yeah, there's the whole bit when they crash through like a beach resort, and you literally see people on the beach getting ripped apart, and limbs flying off, and innocent people just being like mauled into paste. In the background, that's Invincible fights Conquest, and like it is really kind of like, oh man, that is like grim and visceral.
Yeah.
Totally desensitized to violence at this point, but no, you're not.
Yeah, and at the end of the Powerplex episode, there's another unpleasant death, which is a smaller scale, but is just as depressing and affecting. So yeah, they're still very much going there with the depressing material.
Yeah, that was emotionally visceral and disturbing. Again, like that Powerplex episode was just trying to hit all the beats that Batman vs Superman was trying to hit and failed, and like it just so deftly just sort of dances through them all, and it's not the most original or complex plot. It's basically like, in the past, 2 godlike superheroes had fought in a city that led to a lot of destruction, even though one of them was trying to minimize destruction. Inevitably, some people got caught in the crossfire, some people just living normal, regular lives, and that's created a lot of pain and suffering. And then because it's a superhero show, they get channeled into someone becoming a supervillain. It makes sense on paper and it's quite simple, but like it's just doing each beat with like real like emotional intensity and making you feel that like this is a real person who's been really traumatized by their sister being killed in, as just basically background fodder in a season finale cliffhanger action sequence.
Yeah, I mean, it probably helps that they don't then have to do a weird about face wherein the character who is, swearing revenge due to the collateral damage then has to be also the sympathetic lead character of future movies. Yeah, anyway, not reviewing Batman v Superman. God knows that's been done enough. But yeah, no, that episode was good. As a standalone episode, and to be honest, because it's got so much serialized stuff going on, Invincible doesn't actually do that many particularly standalone episodes. That was a good one.
Yeah. That was probably one of the tightest ones. So yeah, there's some really strong bits this season. So, even if the overall review is not quite as good as the past, it doesn't mean it's not like got some of the best stuff, I've seen this year in it, like the Mauler episode, the episode with Powerplex. The finale was spectacular. There's a lot going on here and a lot of good stuff.
Yeah, as I've probably said before about this show, it's doing a good job of actually, creating the ongoing superhero universe comic vibe and, making it work in a TV show. Because, and again, these are things I've said in past Invincible reviews, it can just have the universe just casually exist. It doesn't have to, realign the budget to have another superhero pop in. They can just appear. It doesn't have to, justify their presence by giving them a big action scene. They can just sort of turn up and say hi, and it all just works and hangs together. And the universe actually feels organic and lived in, which is difficult for all the reasons I just said in like live action superhero universes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And also the fact that our audience's familiarity with superhero tropes and storylines means that they can efficiently jump through things. They can just be like, here's some superheroes, and like you don't need to know the details of the origin story, but you do need to get across the characters and personalities quite quickly, which is the show's good at very deftly like dropping its characterization to, rather than spending time explaining how someone became a superhero or whatever, explaining like what they're like, what their personality is. Everyone feels like a real 3-dimensional person, and also so that the world feels like consistent and full of characters, but also it's using the fact that like you get what the deal is here, so let's just like move on to the interesting stuff.
Yeah, I mean, shows like this and The Boys are very much taking advantage of the fact that we're all fairly familiar with basic superhero tropes now, and yeah, fair enough. saves time.
Yeah, like people like us who, it's been more than 25 years since, the X-Men Bryan Singer film came out that kind of kickstarted this huge explosion of superhero media. We've all steeped in it for so long that now, they can tell these interesting different stories because, like, the groundwork's been laid in the past. And, The Boys is a very good example of that as well. And, they're both trying to, I don't know, deconstruct superheroes or say something different about superheroes, than maybe the average MCU film.
Yeah, no, can confirm this is better than Captain America Brave New World.
Yeah, I was literally just thinking the same thing.
Okay, and that was Moderate Fantasy Violence. Thank you very much, as ever, for listening. If you have enjoyed this podcast, then why not go to our website at moderatefantasyviolence.com, where you can find, funnily enough, more episodes of said podcast. Absolutely loads of them at this point, as well as articles written by both of us. Go and give it a look, and if you enjoyed the experience, why not leave us a nice 5-star review on your application of choice. Thank you very much.
You can also follow us on Blue Sky, where we are at MFV Podcast. You can follow us on Twitter, where we are still posting a bit, where we are at MFV Podcast. And you can follow episode updates on Facebook by searching for Moderate Fantasy Violence. You can find me on Blue Sky, Instagram, and TikTok by searching for Alistair Ball. Yes, still posting on TikTok, still trying to make that happen. You can also get more of my writing at redtrainblog.com and find my theatre reviews, including my review of Why I Shoved a Flare Up My Arse for England, discussed above, at everythingtheatre.com.
It's about time someone tried to make TikTok happen. You can find me online by searching for Nick Bryan, that's Brian with a Y, yes, like the first name, on various platforms, probably primarily Blue Sky and Instagram at this point. I also have a website at nickbryan.com, and my next comics Kickstarter for the second issue of Sold is warming its way off the launchpad as we speak, by which I mean it hasn't actually happened yet, but it probably soon will. And we'll be back in 2 weeks with the next episode of Moderate Fantasy Violence, in which we will be covering the second season of weird office drama Severance and the movie Grand Theft Hamlet, in which we see someone trying to stage a production of Hamlet in Grand Theft Auto. See you in 2 weeks for that. Bye-bye.
Bye.